All right, friends, this is the last day of our Esther reading plan, and we're going to spend just a few minutes, all three of us together, talking a little bit about our reflections from the book as a whole. So we hope that this deal has been a real blessing to you, and as always, we would love to hear from you just about how God worked in your life through this plan. So email us, write on social media. We just love to hear from you about how God's working in your life right now. So the last day of the reading, day 15, is chapter 10. And we'll just kind of start there. Any reflections before we get into the book as a whole on chapter 10?
Y'all are both looking at me. For me, chapter 10 is the end cap of this whole story, obviously, but it's also the end cap of the narrative structure. This whole book has been about reversing the fortune of the Jews and the fortune of those who are in power, right? So we start this book with Mordecai. He acts as a representative of all the Jewish people, and they're in exile. They're in this lowly place, and all chapter 10 is about the greatness of Mordecai and him being honored. And so I think it's a beautiful picture of what this book tells us theologically, which is those who are humble and lowly and God's people will be lifted up in the end. And those who are prideful and who abuse their authority and power, those are the ones who are going to be brought down.
Yeah, that's good. And look at that last line. And what is Mordecai using that position that he's in to seek after? Welfare and peace.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. Whereas Haman previously was using his position of power to really pursue the antithesis of those two things.
Well, and even the king was using his power for his own glory and benefit, his own parties.
Look at the splendor.
Yeah.
That's all you want. Even our tapestries are beautiful.
Look at my wife. Isn't she glorious?
Right. Okay, that's good. I want to save a lot of room for the book as a whole. So let's start. Hannah, when you think about the book of Esther as a whole, you've read it before, but in particular this time through, what are you leaving feeling? What are you leaving thinking about? How has it hit you this time around?
Yeah. There's one scene in particular I didn't remember as we reread this book, and it's the scene where the king is up at night, and it's between the first and second banquet, and the king is up at night. He can't sleep, so he says, "Oh, bring me the Chronicles of the King," and he's reading, and he remembers Mordecai and how to honor him. And I read that, and for me, it was a moment of, only God could make that happen. God is not mentioned here. It doesn't say God caused the king to not sleep. But how many moments do we experience in our lives that are highly unlikely? And the timing is just so that we're led to believe God is moving even when we don't hear voices from heaven. And for me, it was both a comfort and a reassurance that the hand of God is at work and at play. And Esther didn't know that between banquet 1 and 2, God was going to move in this way. She was just putting one foot in front of the next, being faithful and wise and stepping forward in faith. And it just reminded me that as I'm acting in the world, I'm not the only actor, that God is moving alongside me, and my job is to cling to him in faith.
That's really good. I hadn't thought about this. When you were talking about that, I was unpacking a box this week, maybe yesterday, and I found something that I saved that I got from my grandparents' house. They both passed away. My grandfather was a woodworker. My grandmother was a painter. And one of the things that he had made was a little wooden block. She had painted a sheep on it, and the quote that she had written on it was, "Don't count the sheep, talk to the shepherd." And it's like kind of cheesy and cliche, but the truth that it points to is the same thing that you're saying here. Maybe when I'm up in the middle of the night, maybe God actually has a word for me in the middle of the night, and like looking for God in those little moments when God isn't not visibly, but like God isn't obviously present.
Yeah.
Like he's not obviously present in Esther. Maybe that is when we get some of the most profound nudges.
Like that's actually one of the most inconsequential events in the story.
Yeah.
King can't sleep, so he asks for the Chronicles of the King to be read out loud. And that is the linchpin turning point for where Mordecai and the fate of the whole Jews hangs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's right. That's good.
Well, and I love it too because for half of this book, even arguably over half, the Mordecai and the Jews are in a position where if you were to ask them how life is going, they would say like, no, it's not going great. You know, things are not very good. But yet, even in the midst of that, there's evidence of God working. And so for all of us, like I think about all the things that we're already going through, even though it's a brand new year and a brand new year is so full of hope. even in the times where we think things are not that great, like, that doesn't mean that God isn't working. He's still active even when we can't see him. Yeah.
That's really good. That's good. AJ, what else do you have?
I think the biggest thing for me is just a sign that we often think that, or I've heard it said, a lot of people say, well, they see tragedy in the world and they think, why doesn't God do something about this? And I think Esther reminds us that the number one way that God works in Scripture is actually through people, through us. And even though God isn't mentioned, he's working through Esther, he's working through Mordecai, he's working through these two servants of the king. And so for us, it's a reminder that when we feel these nudges, when we see injustice in the world and our heart breaks for it, God's calling us to be part of the answer. He's working through us. That's his primary way of working in the world is through us. And I think there's a sense of responsibility to that and us needing to be open to hearing that call. But also, like Esther, and I think you talked about this, being willing to take the step, even if it means putting ourselves in an uncomfortable situation or a risky situation, because that's God at work.
Can I add to that?
Oh, yeah.
You're talking about who God is at work through. You could also argue that God is actually at work through Haman in the evil.
Yeah.
And we talked yesterday about how the Jews would have been wiped out in the whole empire. So India to Ethiopia, all across the Middle East. And it's not like there were Jews in North America at that point. That's the entire Jewish population. And through Haman's evil actions, not only are the Jews spared because of how the story is going, but they're also elevated.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the last line that the Jews were, maybe all these people were converted. Maybe actually they just knew, hey, these are people not to mess with.
Right.
Yeah.
That they were protected in the end. And so for me, when I look at somebody who I think is a really bad dude or woman, I often respond in fear and dread and think, like, how could they have power, without remembering that God even has a mysterious way of working through evil.
So good. Well, and I talked about this in the first email. It's a lot of, it's very reminiscent of the Joseph story. What they intended for evil, God has used for good. And that is all over this book.
Yeah, that's right. And this is a deep cut here. But for those of you that were around in Genesis, one of the things that we talked about that we'd never seen before was, you talk about Joseph, was that Joseph really embraces this like Egyptian identity and never really repents of that. Whereas Esther, at one point you begin to think, and I think Alex, I think you pointed this out, that she seems to be owning this kind of like role as the queen at one point. And then Mordecai kind of snaps her out of it. And she falls kind of out of love with that identity perhaps, and really decides, no, this is who I am. Like, I am one of God's people. I'm one of the Jews. And then through her, God saves these folks. And all of us, of course, begin to take on these identities in our lives. This isn't like just an ancient world problem. We begin to take on these identities in our lives that are the antithesis of maybe what God has us here to do. We become just like everybody else. We become kind of typical folks. But God sometimes has to shake us out of that and say, actually, there's another reason that you're here. Kind of good. Other thoughts that y'all got on to wrap this deal up?
I like that word, typical folk.
Yeah.
I'm going to start using that as an insult. You're just being a typical folk.
I've started saying
Basic.
folk a lot. I don't know why. I've started saying folk quite a bit. You're so basic, right? That would be.
Because it's gender neutral.
That's it. That's what it is. Yeah. I don't know. Anyway, so here's just one kind of final thought that I've got too is, where's that passage? You know, we've been singing this song that we sung it the first week in Cornerstone in this series, "Graves in the Gardens," and part of the reason we sang it is because of this line in here about what happens, that the month, this is in chapter 9, verse 22, that month had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holiday. Isn't that cool? Like they were anticipating this month being a time of great mourning, and it turned into a time of holiday, right? And if that doesn't sum up what we're going after this month with just this idea that the future that we hope for is not the only future with hope. There are lots of places in our lives that are dark and are broken, but we have to believe that God can work for goodness even in those places and turn our darkest places into places of light. It doesn't mean that we don't mourn the loss of that future, but God can still bring something good out of it. I'd never read Esther in one sitting before, and God, it's so powerful And you talk about something you hadn't seen before. That's a line that had never really stuck out to me before. So thanks for being a part of this study. And like I said at the beginning, we would love to hear from you about just how it's impacting you. So we'll be rolling out something new in just a minute. We didn't bring our James book up here, but we will be reading through the book of James next. So you'll be hearing more about that. So pay attention to your email, pay attention to social media. We'll get you all the info, of course, hpmc.org/Bible. And we want to invite you to invite some friends into this next reading also. So until then, God bless you, friends, and we'll see you next time.